It's just after midday, so I think I can say good afternoon to everybody that's here. And I'd like to welcome you to our panel session, our discussion panel session called Bridge Over Brexit. So there's no disguising what it is all about. But my name is Professor Elizabeth Crook, and I work at Ulster University running the Museum Studies programmes there. So for ourselves here on the island, and particularly for the museum sector, both north and south, the consequences of Brexit are felt very deeply, and we're very concerned to continue thinking about what it may mean for the cultural museum and arts sector here on this island and our relationship with the rest of the UK and the EU. So about a year ago, the Irish Museums Association hosted a Brexit event in Belfast, and we had a really good representation of the Irish museum sector there, and colleagues came over from across the water as well. And the outcome of that day was this report, Brexit and the Museum Sector in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which can still be downloaded online. So we thought a year ago, and the contributors here beside me were all part of this event and a part of this process, and we thought a year ago we would have, by the time this conference came along, a very clear idea of what Brexit would mean for these islands. I'm afraid we don't. We still don't, and I'm sure you feel the same way. So we're still exploring it, and that's why this panel still is so important because of that. So we don't have a very clear idea of what Brexit means, continually being negotiated. Unfortunately, it's so continuous in the press that some people actually just want to close off their ears to Brexit. They can't bear it anymore, and I think that could be part of the overall agenda. But as well as that context of the great unknown with Brexit, as many of you who've just come over to Northern Ireland for this conference, you may not be aware that we're also without a government in Northern Ireland. So Stormont hasn't sat since January 2017. Yes, I've got that date right. So we're 2 years without a government here, without a feeling that how do we operate democracy without having Stormont sitting? We don't have people who can really ask the right questions at a governmental level, and we can't direct questions. So we're really in a very tricky situation in Northern Ireland, and certainly look to our colleagues across the islands for guidance. So for us, this panel is extremely important, and the panel members that we've got here today, we feel can really give insights into what Brexit might mean for their institutions. And we're very keen to hear from all of you and what it might mean, you feel it may mean for you. And most of you should have got one of the postcards which we designed together for today, and we'd really appreciate if you could write a comment, a question, a comment, a drawing, whatever you want to put in. It's entirely anonymous, and leave it behind in the auditorium and give it to one of the volunteers. So if you haven't got a postcard, there's more up at the front. So we're really keen to keep that discussion going, because at the end of the day, this is something that's still a lot to be said and a lot to be understood about it. So I'd like to introduce our panel here. And we've got here, we've got Aoife Ruane from Drogheda High Lanes Gallery, which is in the Republic of Ireland. We have Rhiann Coulter from Banbridge F.E. Mcgowan Gallery, which is just outside Belfast, sort of halfway between Belfast and the border. Would that be right? Approximately. We've Heather Mcgowan, who is Curator and Manager of Northdown Museum, which is on the North Coast, and she's also Chair of the Northern Ireland Regional Curators Group. And we have Liam Bradley from Monaghan, who's the Director and Manager Curator of Monaghan County Museum, which is just on the border. So for people with really clear insights of the potential of impact of Brexit in their museum. So each of our panel members are just going to speak for a few minutes just to introduce their position for the moment in relation to Brexit. So would you like to go first?
Thanks, Marie Elizabeth. Hi. Today I'm going to talk about the development of two museums and galleries in a cross-border context, the importance of their existence for their communities and for the region, and how the tenets of their development, the idea of partnership, has informed how they work, and how they can be seen both as an example of how to work across borders. And then I'm going to end with posing a question about what is required in this time of change to protect and secure this cross-border relationship, and the other possible informal relationships that our museum and galleries have in Northern Ireland, Ireland and the UK. So you'll see from some of the slides behind us, Highlands Gallery, as you see when you see the map slide, is located in Drogheda in the Republic of Ireland, as Elizabeth said, on the southern border with Northern Ireland. It is a municipal art gallery for Drogheda in the northeast, a regional gallery in County Louth. It was developed with the Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio in Banbridge, Northern Ireland, north of Drogheda as you look at the map, with a driving distance of 50 minutes, just 50 minutes between them, or 48 miles or 78 kilometres, depending on what system you use, just over a decade ago. And in a cross-border arts partnership that had and around the idea of two art collections. In Drogheda, the Drogheda Municipal Art Collection, featuring Irish and international artists, had been begun by a couple, artist B. Orpin and businessman Terry Trench, in 1946. And in Banbridge, the local authority had been collecting the work of Effie McWilliam, or Frederick Edward McWilliam, the important sculptor and a native of Banbridge, whose career had brought him to London in the early 20th century. The capital project to realise these institutions began in the 1990s in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, and was essentially between two local authorities, Drogheda Borough Council and Banbridge District Council, and their executives. And in this significant project of cross-border cooperation, the aim was to provide a major cultural and tourism resource for the border region in the two galleries, to attract international visitors and to encourage longer stays. But most importantly, this project had at its heart a serious effort to increase cross-community and cross-border cooperation through arts and culture. So while the two local authorities committed substantial funds, along with the International Fund for Ireland and community and individual donations, the major vehicle for the enterprise was enabled by the European Union Fund through the Northern Ireland Interreg 3A programme, and managed for the special EU programmes body by the East Border Region Interreg 3A partnership. The partnership receiving capital funding for the development of both institutions. And after many years of committed cross-border work by the collective councils, external advisors and stakeholders, Highlands Municipal Art Gallery, housed in a former Franciscan church, and you'll see it on the slides, opened 12 years ago in October 2006, while the Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio, a new build, opened 18 months later in 2008. In the last 2 decades, the significant work that has been done in the name of peace and reconciliation on the island in projects like ours has meant that where borders and difference once existed, now cooperation, working together, and a focus on mutual heritage, a commonality, and an acceptance of conflicted histories now exists. In one of the images above, you'll see two artefacts, the Mace and Sword of Drogheda, which are now on permanent view since 2010 in Highlands Gallery. They were given to the Corporation of Drogheda by King William of Orange after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. These objects for many years remained locked away in the strong room of the council offices in Drogheda and taken out only for special groups, mostly from Northern Ireland, to privately view. These important objects and potent symbols, for which so long had divisive connotations, can now be viewed as icons of our shared heritage and continuing good relations. Neither the team at Highlands Gallery, or I can safely say for Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio, take our good relationships and partnership for granted, as in reality this is all still quite new and potentially fragile. I was reminded of this recently when the Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio celebrated their first decade, and at a ceremony where a significant number of the original council officials, many now retired, attended. Many who spent years working cross-border with council officials in Drogheda and Louth. These guardians of our galleries were still present, aware, and quietly continuing to support and witness our very special cultural enterprise in this next decade and in this changing political landscape. It has been such an exciting and invigorating time working along the border and in partnership with Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio, both institutions striving and achieving full museum accreditation within our jurisdictions, engaging and attracting audiences for art, working with our collections and supporting artist practice. We've shared many exhibitions through the years between our galleries, shared audiences, shared connections and contacts, research and experience, as well as practical things like equipment. We've seen the Northeast come alive with art and with the arts and culture, both incoming and outgoing. In fact, that very part of our joint genetic code that is about partnership has become so integral to how both of our galleries operate, with other galleries and institutions both on the island and with our museum, gallery and collection colleagues in the UK. Partnership is central to how we capitalise and add value for our projects in development, working with artists on ambitious projects and installations, and both extending our own collections out and in turn borrowing from national collections on the island, from the UK and across Europe. In this time also, the Arts Council of Ireland and Northern Ireland have also enabled cross-border funding for touring exhibitions, which we have taken full advantage of in major exhibitions of senior Irish artists and Northern Irish artists like Susan McWilliam and Janet Mullarney. We know that through partnership, we can achieve a whole lot more. This conference and its timing has been significant for Ian Coulter and I and our museum and galleries, as in the next few weeks we make our very first cross-border exhibition that will run simultaneously in both galleries. Titled Crossing Lines, it expresses both the strength of our relationship and the others that we have with the Arts Council's collection in London, as well as the National Museums Northern Ireland, where we will together borrow work and as well as from artist studios, including that of Nigel Rolfe and George Gerard. The timing of this conference, 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and I know for the second time in Northern Ireland, is important, as are the overarching themes of dissent, dissonance and difference, as they will be explored in this exhibition. So, while the Republic of Ireland will continue within the European Union, and with the changes Brexit brings for Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, and as borders potentially become a reality, metaphorically and or physically, what will this mean for our cross-border relationship? From our perspective, partnerships across the island and in the UK, it has taken us 20 years to get to this position of collaboration, and we're now only reaping the benefit of that creative thinking. The public cares, artists care, curators care about what's on the horizon. What can we do to ensure the fluidity and the imagination of our partnership and partnerships, to protect them for our communities, for our audiences, for our artists, and the dynamism and neighbourliness that is a key feature of our relationships? What do we need to ensure that this vibrancy and connectedness continues across our EU, non-EU borders in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the UK, and that they're not diminished or lost? We know good relationships, good projects take time, and they are about interpersonal relationships and commitment. They are about people and not borders. And I suppose I wonder, is there a role for informal relationships in informing policy for museums? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aoife, and I think she's asked some really important questions there about how do we maintain the important relationships that we have been built for so long. Like when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, the border was a very obvious place. If you went across the border, I went to the beach in Donegal. You went through a checkpoint and your boot would be opened and they would check and look at the buckets and spades and the towels and say, yes, they are going to the beach. So, you know, we do not, none of us want to go back to that, but what has happened in the last 20 years is an invisible border. And it's both physically invisible and also fading into the background of our minds, so that when you talked about the metaphorical border, that's what we have now. It has faded back, and that's why the partnerships that you've described didn't happen overnight and now still need to be nurtured very much. So we'll continue maybe on that theme with yourself, Brianne. So, let's do this.
It's very heavy. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Aoife. I think Aoife's done a great job of sort of explaining how we work together between the Highlands and the FE. So I suppose I want to just talk a little bit about the reality of working in a museum on the border and what Brexit may bring. So, as Aoife has described, the F.E. Mcwilliam Gallery was born out of a cross-border collaboration. And when I took up the post of curator in 2009, it meant coming back to Northern Ireland, a place I'd left at the age of 19 to study and work in Dublin, London and the US. Although the gallery is only 20 minutes drive from the border and located just off the main Dublin to Belfast road, I was shocked by how little cross-border cooperation there was and how few connections. It just wasn't in the psyche of the people, no matter what side of the community they were from. Everyone looked to Belfast and then to London. Although the physical infrastructure of the border was gone, as Elizabeth pointed out, there was still for many a psychological border, a border of the mind. This situation was strengthened by the fact that the gallery was and is entirely run and funded by the local borough council. Obviously, local government politics in Northern Ireland is a reflection of our regional politics, and thus largely divided along unionist and nationalist lines, with their respective views on the border, national identity, and Europe. Our council was and is predominantly unionist, with all that implies. However, as Aoife has explained, the F.E. Mcgowan Gallery was built with European money and was from the beginning linked to the Highlands Gallery in Drogheda. Aoife and I had started our careers together at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, and so ours was a natural collaboration, and one that, as Aoife has described, is very much an ongoing partnership. In addition to our relationship with the Highlands, we at the FE have also toured or co-curated exhibitions with many other institutions in the Republic of Ireland, including the National Gallery of Ireland, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, the Royal Hibernian Academy, NCAD, the Art College, and galleries in Kilkenny and Cork and West Cork. In each case, partnership and collaboration has allowed us to do more better. So what happens after Brexit? What has been happening since the referendum? We programmed 2 years in advance, and when I look at the schedule post-March 2019, there are only 2 exhibitions that will travel from the Republic to Banbridge, both interesting and important, but neither absolutely fundamental to our programme. All the others are either self-generated or may not tour, or are coming from the mainland UK. I don't think I consciously planned this, but at some level perhaps I have been preparing for the worst. What I can't prepare for is the audiences we will lose if a hard border is imposed. A look around the gallery car park on any average day results in several Irish registrations. On a bank holiday weekend, every third car is Southern. The big Tesco's and the outlet shopping centre across the road tell a similar story. Will they still come after March 2019? Will they be able to? We have a staff member who lives just across the border in Carlingford and numerous suppliers in Dublin and beyond. Will we still be able to tour exhibitions without huge import tariffs? Will we be able to handle the paperwork that might result in? Will artists still want to show in Northern Ireland? I know of numerous artists, curators and academics who commute across the border every day. Will they decide it's time to jump ship? To be honest, the practical problems, while frightening and problematic, are not the worst of it. For me, the psychological effect is the biggest danger. After 10 years back in Northern Ireland, I'm only just getting used to the strange version of a post-conflict society that 30 years of violence has caused. Will Brexit turn Northern Ireland back in on itself, just as it's beginning to look outwards? Will it stop people travelling and living where they want? Of course, many of us in Northern Ireland have Irish passports, but I've had one all my life, and yet it was not until I travelled abroad and lived in Dublin that I actually felt that I had the right to identify as Irish, or indeed European. Cultural identity has been so contentious here that even thinking about what it meant to be Irish or British or somewhere in between was problematic. Despite all the brilliant artists, musicians and writers who have born and worked here in Northern Ireland, I think we're only just beginning to feel that we have the right to celebrate and feel pride in the unique shared culture of this place. Brexit threatens all of that. It threatens our culture, our economy, our way of life. What does it mean if we can't bring art exhibitions across the border? Museums help us to figure out who we are, where we come from, and where we're going. If Brexit forces us to turn our backs on the border, how can we hope to engage with or contribute to the culture, heritage and identity of our communities and our visitors? Most of all, Brexit makes me concerned that all the progress we have made in the 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement could come crashing down. I belong to that generation who grew up during the Troubles and came of age just as the ceasefire and the Good Friday Agreement were coming into being. We have been the beneficiaries of the EU. Europe helped the people of Northern Ireland move beyond their entrenched identities and communities and provided a bigger shared identity. That identity, our shared society, and our peace are juvenile and incredibly fragile. On a personal level, I fear for my children, their prospects, and the cultural environment in which they're going to grow up. Will they, like generations before them, leave as soon as they can, never to return? Brexit makes me question whether I did the right thing coming back here. It makes me wonder what will become of us and whether it wouldn't be better to move back to the right side of the border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. And I think that is sort of part heartfelt plea, and part, I think both papers have both drawn home the point that there's the practical issue, but there is that very much, you could say, emotional issue of what it means living on this island, and what it means to have good neighbours and good relationships. And in both presentations, the word fragility came up, about the fragile reality, and I think that's an important point for us to always consider. So next to speak, we have Heather Mcgowan, as I said, from the Regional Curators Group and North Down Museum. Heather.
Hello. That side of the table has their papers and they're very organised, where Liam and I are much more, let's just go for it and give our experiences. I'm now wishing I had written a few notes, but anyway. So really, I'm here with two hats on. One is as the chair of the Northern Ireland Regional Curators Group, and that group was set up around 1988. And one of its main purposes when it started was to lobby government, and it was beneficial and pretty much helped begin the Northern Ireland Museums Council in Northern Ireland and kind of bring us up to par with the rest of the UK to have that service within this country. And really that group has continued on ever since. So it's made up of representatives from local authority museums across Northern Ireland. There are 44 accredited museums here, and just about half, just under half, are local authority. So it's a great way for us to get together, to network, to develop projects, to moan and discuss about the challenges we're facing within our local authorities, and everybody at the table understands exactly what you're going through. In Northern Ireland itself, and I know we're talking about Brexit, many of our local authorities are still going under the review or still going through the process of the review of public administration. So although Brexit is very important, many of them are so caught in their own governance issues within their local authorities merging into larger authorities, and the battles are still being fought, to be honest, on that front, let alone anything cross-border. So for many museums, that's all happening in conjunction with what's happening with Brexit and not knowing what's happening with Brexit. So that is an issue for local authority museums here. Our local authority museums, they are spread across, obviously, the country, and our experiences are all very different. Many of the ones closer to the border are doing fantastic cross-border work and have been for decades, really. And that has not necessarily been done because they've been told to do that. It's because they want to do that, and they want to develop relationships, and they see the importance of developing those relationships, cross-border, sharing collections, sharing history, sharing experiences. So my other hat is as the manager of North Down Museum, because we're 13 miles up the road and we're not near a border. So we have a different experience than perhaps our other local authority museums like Derry and like Fermanagh and like Newry. So it was also for me to kind of bring that side of it as well. And so after we decided to do this talk, I thought, well, we're not affected at all. We're not near the border. We're not affected. And then you do start to think about it a bit more, and you realize, well, actually, we probably are, and more than we realize. So for my museum in particular, we do have cross-border relationships already. We have one with Monaghan. We have one with Cavan. We share collections. And where possible, we do work together. But I've realized that a lot of this has been done through peace funding. And for us and for many local authority museums in Northern Ireland, that is a big worry as well. So it's very difficult to get money from your own council to do things within your own borough, let alone doing anything cross-border without additional outside funding. And for us, peace funding is where, it's peace and reconciliation funding, for those of you who don't know, is where we've been going to for years to develop cross-border projects that involve our museums, local communities, bringing communities together from both sides of the border. And even as a museum that's nowhere near the border, we've been doing that as well. We're currently have 3 peace projects on the go, which look at our collections in our local communities and do go across the border as well where we can. So I think for me, speaking on behalf maybe of local authority museums, I think that for all of us will be a massive impact. And Piece 4 will now go up to 2020. I have heard Piece 5 has been declared, so there will be something past Brexit. But after that, what will happen is a worry. And if that funding is not there to allow us to continue these relationships, the will is there. But if there's not money to back us up, it might prove very difficult for us to be able to do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. And now we'll move to Liam Bradley from Monaghan County Museum.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just wanted to start by thanking the Museum Association for facilitating our discussion today, and also the Irish Museum Association, in particular, Gina Kelly, who's done so much work to develop and set up the talk today. So thank you for that, Gina. Like Heather, I'm wearing 2 hats today. The primary hat is as the chair of the Local Authority Museums Network. So for the few of you who don't know, I'm sure everyone knows who that is. There are 12 local authority museums in the Republic of Ireland. So the Local Authority Museums Network is a representative body for those 12 museums. We would meet 3 to 4 times a year in Dublin, typically in the National Museum. And we've been working for years with our counterparts and our partners in Northern Ireland through the Northern Ireland Regional Curators Group. And I suppose a lot of the speakers have already said that we've all grown up in that period of the Troubles ending, the reconciliation period after that. And we've seen an awful lot of positives come out of that. My other hat being the curator, director, manager, everything else in between of Monaghan County Museum, which is situated just a few miles south of the border in the Republic of Ireland. We have done a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years through peace and reconciliation funding, which has been a real bedrock to really start that discussion, start that hard work of bringing divided communities together, talking about very, very difficult issues, but using the collection as a catalyst. And I really believe that that is one of the real strengths of museums. That uniqueness, that specialness, the tactile aspect of it, it's right there. Something that maybe represents one thing to you, represents something else to somebody else in the room, but you can't ignore it. You have to talk about it. And that brings on another discussion. I think that's a real strength that museums have, both north and south. And I think looking forward now into Brexit, my feeling is it'll be grand. But I do believe there's a positive aspect to this as well. Necessity is a mother of invention after all. Brexit's coming, whether we like it or not. It's going to happen next March, probably. But it doesn't all have to be bad. There's going to be challenges, yes, depending on whatever structure is put in place. Nobody knows what that structure is going to be. It may or may not affect the movement of staff and objects, and that may or may not have an effect on what we can do with our partners in the north and in hopefully the UK, on the mainland of Britain, in Wales, Scotland and England, that we can look to new partnerships. I think Piece 5 is going to come down the line and we'll certainly benefit from that. I think we are the only border between the UK, which will leave the EU, and the Republic of Ireland, which is in the EU. I think the Republic of Ireland and the LMAN in particular are very strongly based to actually reach out to our regional partners, continue to build on the relationships in the north and look for opportunities in England, in Scotland and in Wales, because one thing that Brexit has shown us is that there is certainly divided communities in England, in Scotland and Wales that voted either side of it, voted to leave and to remain, and you can argue all day for the social, political reasons for that, but they're there anyway. The other thing about them is that they're subtle and they're nuanced. It's very hard to put your finger on it. It's very hard to say, well, that house definitely voted to leave, that house definitely voted to remain. It's a little bit easier in Belfast if you're walking around. You can sort of spot the unionist areas and the nationalist areas. They're very decent about that. They put up their flags and paint things, and it makes it very, again, very convenient. You know where to pop out and with your Free State accent and ask for directions, and where not. But I mean, I'm joking just to make a bit of a lighter aspect of the subject. The fact is, nuanced borders are something that we've dealt with for years. We've looked at for years the Catholic and Protestant aspect, Protestant Unionist loyalists, Catholic nationalist, Republican side of it. Brexit's turned that 90 degrees. Now we've got Catholics and Protestants who vote to remain, Catholics and Protestants who vote to leave. And we have to look at our partners, potential partners then in England, Scotland and Wales. You can't touch that funding anymore. That money's going to be gone after March for you. It won't be for us though. Depending on whatever structure that may take, there will be opportunities, I believe, through the back door to reach out to new communities, to new partners and say, look, okay, you can't directly interact with this funding, but we're doing a programme here looking at how borders, subtle borders in the community and how we can overcome them. You have them as well, different ones, but the same. And the one thing I believe is there's way more that binds us and separates us. And the final point I'll make is, you know, in museums we're all just people. Yes, we have headings, we have titles, and we have backgrounds, and we have lots of qualifications, and it's all very fancy. But at the end of the day, we're just people. We come from places, and we have our own prejudices, we have our own backgrounds. We all have a love and a passion for museums and history. And that's one thing, I think, that will lead to more opportunities post-Brexit in the long term than maybe the initial challenges will bring.
Okay, thank you very much, Liam. I'm sort of a little bit reminded of New Year's Eve 2000, when we thought the airplanes would fall out of the sky because they weren't Y2K ready. So in a sense, are we Brexit ready? Are you stockpiling? Who is stockpiling? Is anybody here stockpiling? We've also got the added concern in Ireland that our milk is processed, and my brother's a dairy farmer, his milk is processed across the border. What will happen to his milk? Can they cross the border in time? And even worse, Guinness is kegged in Northern Ireland. So if you're not getting your Guinness across the water, it's because you voted Brexit. I'm sure none of you voted Brexit. But so that is the scenario planning we're talking about. And just for in the next sort of 5 minutes before we open it up to the floor, I have 2 questions for the panel and maybe 1 question for the audience. So my 2 questions are in the area of what is your scenario planning, if you want to say quite briefly. And the second question is with regard to identity, and we've talked a lot about the importance of exploring what identity means on this island and the contribution the cultural sector has to exploring identity issues, and what role will a museum have beyond Brexit to address and explore the multi aspects to identity. So not everybody here has that, you don't have to answer all the questions, but maybe across this way, if you've got thoughts on scenario planning.
Okay, well, I mean, I think very simply, I mean, one is going to expect that there's going to be taxes and tariffs. So there's, you know, and then obviously there'll be additional considerations in relation to customs. So I think for us, we're certainly assuming that will change how we work, but it won't stop how we work. And I think in that way that we're continuing to work, we're planning a partnership with a museum and gallery in Peterborough in the UK next year on an artist who originally his family came from Ireland. His name is Graham Crowley, and we'll continue to work with museums and galleries where we can. But I suppose that it does have practical considerations, but I think in a way it may affect budget and time would be where I think just very simply. And then in relation to identity, I mean, I've spoken about the fact that Rhiannon and I, you know, we're, I suppose, exploring multiple ideas around dissonance and dissent within this next exhibition, which will look at, I suppose, gender, sexuality, race, class, and so we'll be exploring that difference, I suppose, in our next exhibition.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Liam, you're hoping for a positive outcome from Brexit. Like, are you scenario planning for that, for what you might do in the coming years?
Look, I mean, I'm not sitting here saying that, you know, I drank the Kool-Aid and I'm sort of on one side completely. I'm just saying that there's an opportunity here. There's opportunities everywhere. We just have to see them from what they are. Am I specifically planning for it? No, because I have no idea what Brexit's going to be. Nobody does. There's no wise old man or old woman who can tell me right now how it's all going to go. There's just us. You know, as a group here collectively, we're going to have to figure it out together. But I do believe if the will's there, and I really do believe it is, and again, that's born in 20 years now of experience in museums, where people realise that cooperation is the strength of any museum. You know, a project is good on its own, but it's 10 times better if you're working with other organisations. And I think those overarching themes will literally and figuratively get over that border. So we're going to continue to reach out in the short term to our partners in the north, and we're going to be looking very hard for partners in Britain as well. But no, I mean, honestly, there's nothing specific at the moment, no.
Okay, and do you want to make a final point?
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, really looking forward. We only have a couple of exhibitions, like full exhibitions, which are coming from the south, which is unusual for us because the last couple of years, everything has been coming back and forth. But I think it's going to make us work differently. If you think about bringing a whole exhibition of sculpture or painting across the border, that's one thing, and I think that is going to be difficult. I hope it's not, but I think it will. So, I mean, you know, video, performance, artists coming to make work in the space, things like that, I think we're going to have to be quite clever and figure ways around that. I'm also considering smuggling, which I think might be a possibility as well. How many paintings can you get in the back of a big car, I think, might be an option. In terms of identity, I think it's actually going to focus us more on identity. I think it's becoming, you know, I obviously am very emotional about this issue, as there are many other people here, and I think it'll make us be much more conscious about representing different identities and make sure that we really do fulfill that role, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have another question, either for the panel or for the audience, and it sort of reflects and links to the theme of this conference and the theme of dissent. And on the one hand, you know, reading the various reports that have come out in the last 6 months on Brexit, and according to those reports, the cultural sector very much voted Remain. And it makes me ask the question, if the cultural sector is voted Remain and our visitors, or a good portion of our visitors have voted to leave, how do we get that connection between the cultural sector and our audiences? Is there a disconnect rising between what the cultural sector feels and wants to pursue and what some of our audiences would be more interested in the cultural sector doing? So I don't know whether Brexit forces us to think again about what we are doing as a sector and the nature of the connection with. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that.
Well, I suppose in relation to that question, I mean, I love that idea of are we alienating a part of society? You know, I mean, it's always something that will drive you forward and want to do more. Yeah, I suppose we are. But, you know, that's the great thing about museums. You're never finished. You're always trying to figure out new ways to develop your service, develop your collections, and look for new audiences. And at the end of the day, it's limited resources, so you do have to target audiences. So there are times where you're targeting a specific audience, and by that very definition, you're alienating another audience. I don't know how you can get away with that. I mean, we want to be facilitators of discussion. We want to be that middle part of the road. You don't want to be one side or the other, which I think is much harder to do than take a side. But at the same time, unless you've got unlimited resources and unlimited buildings, you inevitably do have to go and focus on certain areas if you want to be a success, rather than trying to be all things to all people, because you're never going to please all the people all the time. So I think that's inevitable in museums, but I think, again, Brexit will bring up that option and that issue, and, you know, when it does come up, we can look at it and take it forward from there, I think.
Okay, thank you, Liam. We now have time for the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience, and I sort of have a question I'd like to throw out to you, and you can answer it if you want. or ask your own questions. But like we were very interested over here in the rise of the idea of a Brexit museum that happened sort of in the last 6 months. The Museum of Sovereignty, the Festival of Britishness, ideas that have come out since the Brexit vote and in the last sort of 6 months. Any of you who run museums in an area that very much voted exit, voted leave, how are you responding? Does this have a consequence for you in your museums? So if you want to answer that question, do. If you want to ask your own question, please put it to any of the members of the panel. There's a question there, red jumper.
I just wanted to, I'm not going to answer your question, I'm afraid.
Okay, don't worry, you don't have to.
Apart from anything else, I don't work in a museum, I'm a consultant. But my question is, the idea of nuanced borders is a new one for England. It's not something we've ever had to deal with before, and I live in Cambridge, and you can see where the divide is for those communities that voted leave and those that voted remain, either through Facebook, Twitter, and the virtual way in which people are communicating it, and also through flags. The use of flags is something that's come up recently that you've never seen before in a place like Cambridge, which is very much a Remain city. So some of us have been pushing very passionately, and I freely admit I'm very passionate that Brexit should not happen, and slightly sort of saddened by quite how fatalistically people on the panel were talking about the fact that Brexit is happening and therefore we just need to get on with it. My question is to you and to the audience is, how are museums in the UK challenging the idea of Brexit, whether Brexit will happen, in the same way as Queen's Museum was talking about this morning? If they had a direct response to when Trump came in, how are museums actually responding to it and finding ways that we can push forwards so that Brexit isn't going to happen, that the second vote is a possibility? That because we're doing lots of stuff in our community. I don't do anything with my local museums, but yeah, I'll stop.
I'm totally with you. If only, I hope you could be right. I did, jokingly mention to my colleagues and other colleagues, we should start a campaign called Curators Against Brexit. Should we be actively, as a sector, if we voted Remain, should we be campaigning? Is there a feeling that's the direction we should go in?
Well, we should be campaigning to get Ireland back to the Irish. I just repeat it again, why are we got partition? Why is all these issues coming up for us? Ireland, why can't those who want to leave from Britain leave Europe, but give us back our island?
Well, I think the point you've made there is Brexit has raised, it is, for us on this island, there's a lot of old politics, it's not old politics, but long-lived politics, if you like, that can be linked to Brexit and is what raises a lot of feeling and has moved, to people, a lot of action in response to it. So I think your point does resonate with the Brexit debate. Sorry, Liam, and then I saw your hand, so I'll come back.
Just to, I suppose, give an answer, no. I mean, I don't think museums should have any role in that whatsoever. I think Brexit's, unless there's some amazing turnaround, unless Theresa May is playing incredibly close cards to her chest, there's no way Brexit's not going to happen. So I don't know if it's fatalistic or just accepting the reality of it. Eventually you have to. I mean, I personally think it's a terrible idea, but it's happening. So I don't believe museums should be taking sides and advocating one side or the other, because once you do that, then you are one side or the other. You're no longer one of those institutions that people can come and actually discuss. You're no longer a safe space anymore. For me, you're not even a museum anymore, you're an advocacy tool. So no, I don't think we should be getting involved in the debate directly at all. I think we should be reflecting it, but not taking a side.
Thank you, Liam. And there was a question from this lady.
Emily has one up there.
All right,
Hello, I'm Sandra from Historic England. I wanted to pick up on something that the previous session in this room said this morning. I was in the session earlier looking at the decade of commemoration, and one of the speakers was talking about how the principles that have been assigned to that have been about using facts to dispel myth, and that how museums are very well placed to deal in facts and can use those facts to dispel long-held myths. There were many, many myths perpetuated around the whole Brexit conversation. Do museums therefore have a role to use their facts to dispel some of those myths?
I would think so, and I think that's the role of museums, working with the cultural sector, working with the academics, working with campaigners on the ground who are collecting that sort of data that you might be talking about, working with colleagues and writing newspapers. Fintan O'Toole being an example in the Irish Times, who's written really well on Brexit. So yes, I think there is scope post-Brexit to collect the Brexit fever, you know, collect the moment, document it, show the type of myths that arose over our relationship with the EU, and you know, myths and truths, and document and explore it. Definitely there will be that legacy of it. Anybody else want to comment from the panel? I think there was another question. Yes? Yeah.
It was linked to the previous two questions, actually, and your response, Liam. I suppose I feel that, and just having come from the Too Hot to Handle session, which is really interesting just before this, that perhaps there's an opportunity for museums, even if they're not partisan, to allow the conversation, not just allow it, but actively advocate for these burning questions, which is, as we've all been hearing, is going to dramatically affect the way we live and work, especially with our communities, that surely there's a key opportunity for us to grasp that, even if we can't change it, which we may or may not be able to do. But it does feel like there's a bit of a lack there. Potentially, it's such a big issue and it's not really being discussed in our museums. So actually, that wasn't really a question. But what do people think?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. I don't believe we should be advocating one side or the other, but definitely that's, I suppose, the point I want to really make today. Museums have a great opportunity now. We can step out and really say, look, we can be that space to talk about this. We can be that space to have those really difficult discussions. We have, again, using the collection as a catalyst. That's the key for museums. That's what makes us unique. That's what makes us special. That's what we have to do now. We have to use the opportunity of Brexit, whether we want it or not, to be seen in our own communities as this viable thing, another thing that museums can do. This is somewhere that we're going. We're not just going for the exhibition or the talk. We're going for this talk about something that's happening now. You know, and that might be facilitated discussions, or it might be a reminiscence session using collections. But like that we're talking about Brexit, what does it mean? Because we've already mentioned today, the identity issues are a key thing for the next. I mean, my son's 19. He grew up knowing nothing about the Troubles. He's fairly clear in his identity, he thinks. Not anymore, though. My daughter's 6. She's going to grow up in a very different world, so she's going to have a lot of questions living on the border, especially where we live in Dundalk, which is 2 minutes nearly from the border and you get in the car. So I say now, museums, step forward. This is your chance. Really own that space. You know, like other areas have done, have sort of owned areas. This is an opportunity for us museums to own this. We can say, well, look, if you want to come and discuss this, in our case, come to local authority museums, come to the Northern Ireland Regional Curators groups, or come to some of our partners in other parts of the UK and talk about this. So I thoroughly agree with you. I just say, but I don't believe we should be taking sides.
Thank you, Liam. And Rhiannon, you wanted to...
Yeah, I suppose that's really the whole point of this exhibition that we're doing, which opens on the 23rd and 24th of November, so very soon. It's called Crossing Lines because you couldn't call it Brexit, really. And it's not just about Brexit, but it is that idea of, I think, particularly contemporary artists are very good at responding to something that's happening around them. I mean, really, we're in the middle of history here, aren't we, as always? And it's very difficult to do an exhibition, a museum exhibition about Brexit, because we're literally, you're too close to it in a sense. We don't know what's happening. But I think, I mean, the image on the invitation is Joy Gerard's Brexit protests from London. So our way of doing that is to engage contemporary artists through performance and through their work, and to really open up that discussion, and also to link it to other protests. I mean, there's so many protests have been happening in Ireland recently with the repeal movement as well. So it's trying to look at that idea of activism as well. So that's really, I suppose, our way of doing it.
Okay, thank you, Rhiannon. And I think we've a question back here. Yes.
This one's on? Indeed it is. Emily from University College Dublin. Just picking up on what you were saying, Elizabeth, about the idea around a museum of Brexit or something like that. I'm just put in mind of the project that John Byrne did, which I think is around 1997, of the Border Interpretative Centre that he set up temporarily on the border and gave it all the kind of accoutrements of a welcome to the border, interpreting the Irish border itself, because this is something that, has never really received direct interpretation or acknowledgement in that way. And I think he hired Kevin McAleer to unveil a plaque, for this temporary border interpretative centre. So there's such a long history, I suppose, in terms of the significance and the meaning of the border. And we've been talking quite a lot about initiatives that are reaching out to communities on the island of Ireland itself. But in some ways, it's a little bit kind of continuing that conversation amongst ourselves. Whereas what's happened during the whole debate over Brexit that I think has been very distressing for a lot of people on this island is the lack of knowledge that we see expressed, particularly in the mainstream British media, about the lived conditions of the border itself. And that although it's going to be needed to continue to have exhibitions exploring identity and the border in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, what we really need to see them is them happening in Britain. So that actual experience that Rhiannon is talking about, that porosity of the border and the enormous changes that the Good Friday Agreement has brought out, that this is really perhaps, there's a level of public understanding which doesn't seem to currently exist in my experience in Britain over what it's actually like, or what it was like to live in Ireland in the 1970s and how vast that change and shift has been. And I think that that's a space of museum work that needs to be done also. So,
Emily, I think that's a very good point, and I think it links very much to what Liam said, that almost, the border museums have a new task to do, and to build on the strength of what they have, to comment on that, and, as you say, reach across the Irish Sea to our neighbours, to really express the impact of Brexit. I think also I feel very strongly that as we reflect back on borders, and certainly that earlier interest in border studies that sort of came up with the Good Friday Agreement, so back in the early 2000s, we have a very different Ireland now to the one of 20 years ago. We're a far more multicultural place. We have a lot of people who weren't born on this island who are now living on this island, and we've first generation families from migrant groups. And we have to think really deeply about the identity issues raised by Brexit for those communities on the island. I have a good colleague who's Turkish who told me last night that on a weekly basis he gets abuse shouted across to him in Belfast. There has been some research on rise of racism and associated with Brexit. So there's a lot that's really important for us as a cultural sector to think about and address, and it is a new task for us now, and I'm sure it's keenly felt by all of you in your museums and the cultural places you work. We're now just past 10 past, so unless there's a really burning question, I think we'll have to finish there. But Dash, I have to say a thank you before you dash. But I really would love you all to take a postcard, write a comment before you leave this room, and the volunteers have postcards, and there's more at the front if the volunteers have run out. So please, we really want to gather your thoughts so that we really appreciate what it means across these islands. But just to finish, like Liam said, I'd like to thank the Museums Association for having our panel, and I'd very much like to thank Gina O'Kelly, who of the Irish Museums Association, for proposing. I thought you'd gone, Gina. You moved. So I'd like to thank Gina for proposing this panel, and I'd like to thank her for the work that we've done together over the past year, and the panel members here have been contributing on a regular basis to that work, and work that is continuing. I mentioned at the beginning our report. I will tweet the link to the report, and you'll find me on the hashtag Bridge Over Brexit. So I'll tweet the link so that you can all go through and find out what we all together have been thinking about over the last 12 months. And good luck, everybody. Get Brexit ready. Okay.